My jaw dropped when I saw her walk in. There she was, my wife, arm in arm with her best friend, laughing like they didn't have a care in the world. But that wasn't what made my blood run cold. It was the 6 men who followed them in, each one grinning like they were in on some private joke. And maybe they were, at my expense. I felt like a fool just standing there, drink in hand, watching this twisted parade of betrayal unfold before me. They didn't even notice me at first. They were too busy with their sick little party. I watched as they sauntered toward a table in the corner, completely oblivious to the fact that I was there, that I had just witnessed the beginning of something that was going to change everything. With a deep breath, I set my glass down and strode across the bar, the noise of the place dying away in my ears. I reached their table, and it was only then that my wife looked up, her smile fading for a moment as our eyes locked. She didn't seem surprised, though, more like she'd been expecting me to show up eventually. "What the hell is going on here?" I demanded, my voice steady but full of fury. She didn't flinch. Instead, she leaned back in her chair, crossed her legs, and barked, "Fuck off, asshole, don't bother us." Her words hit me like a slap, but before I could respond, one of the men, a big guy with a tattoo snaking up his neck, stood up. He stepped toward me, a smug grin on his face. "Don't worry, cuckold," he sneered. "This bitch can handle all of us. She has experience." I stared at him, the rage boiling inside me. I could have swung at him, could have knocked that grin right off his face, but I didn't. Instead, I turned and walked away, feeling their laughter echo in my ears as I left the bar. But I wasn't running. No, I was planning. My thoughts were racing as I headed to my car, and by the time I reached it, I knew exactly what I was going to do. Revenge was a dish best served cold, they say, but in this case, it was going to be served scorching hot. I wasn't just going to get even. I was going to devastate her, ruin everything she thought she could get away with. I drove home, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. The house was empty when I got there, of course. They were all still at the bar, probably drinking and laughing at my expense, not knowing what was coming. I had a few hours to set my plan into motion, and I wasn't going to waste a single minute. I started in the living room, the place where so many memories had been made, most of them now tainted. There was the couch where we used to sit together, the TV we used to watch late at night. But all of that was about to change. By the time she got back, nothing would be the same again. I could see it all in my mind's eye. How they would walk into the living room, their drunken giggles filling the silence. How she would pause when she saw what I had done, the horror dawning on her as she realized that I wasn't going to let this slide. And the best part? I was going to make sure she never forgot this night. Not ever. This was only the beginning, and as I prepared for the night ahead, I knew that by the end of it, she would regret every single choice that led her to this point. But that was for later. For now, I had work to do. The house was eerily quiet as I moved through it, my footsteps echoing in the empty rooms. Every picture frame, every piece of furniture seemed to mock me with memories of a life that was never as perfect as I had wanted to believe. I needed to clear my mind, focus on the task at hand. This wasn't the time for sentimentality or second-guessing. What I was about to do required precision, not hesitation. I went into the basement first, where I kept a few items that most people wouldn't expect to find in a suburban home. My wife never ventured down here, said it gave her the creeps, so it was the perfect place to start. I pulled out an old suitcase, dusty from years of neglect, and unzipped it to reveal the tools I would need for the night. One by one, I laid them out on the workbench, a length of sturdy rope, a pair of handcuffs, some heavy-duty duct tape, and a small, unassuming device I had picked up years ago, back when I still worked in security. It was a voice recorder, the kind you could easily hide in a room without anyone noticing. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd once used this to catch criminals, and now I was using it for something far more personal. I picked up the recorder, turning it over in my hands as I imagined the scenario playing out. My wife, drunk and distracted, wouldn't even notice the tiny device tucked away in the corner of the living room. But it would hear everything: their laughter, their dirty jokes, the disgusting sounds of their betrayal. And I would listen to it later, every sordid detail, until I couldn't take it anymore. But first, I would need evidence for what would come next. Once I had everything ready, I moved back upstairs, the adrenaline starting to course through me. My heart was pounding in my chest, but my hands were steady as I began setting up the recorder in the living room. I found the perfect spot for it, hidden behind a bookshelf, with just enough of an angle to pick up the entire room. They wouldn't notice a thing. After that, I made my way to the kitchen. I wasn't much of a cook, but I knew how to make one hell of a cocktail. Tonight's special was going to be a little something extra. I pulled out a bottle of whiskey from the cabinet, one I knew my wife liked to drink with her friends. It was the good stuff, smooth and strong, and I planned to make it the last drink she'd ever enjoy in this house. I carefully measured out the whiskey into a decanter, then reached for the vial I had hidden in the back of the spice rack. The liquid inside was colorless and odorless, but I knew it packed a punch. Just a few drops were enough to knock someone out cold for hours, and I added a bit more than that, just to be sure. I stirred it into the whiskey, the liquid swirling as it mixed, and then poured a few glasses, setting them out on a tray like I was some kind of gracious host. The living room was almost ready. I dimmed the lights, creating the perfect atmosphere for their little party. My wife loved mood lighting, said it made everything feel more intimate. Well, tonight would be intimate, all right. Intimately painful. I sat down on the couch, the same couch where we had spent so many nights together, and waited. The minutes dragged by, each one feeling like an eternity. My mind kept playing out different scenarios, each one darker than the last, but I pushed those thoughts aside. I couldn't afford to lose my nerve now, not when I was so close. Finally, I heard the unmistakable sound of the front door opening. My heart skipped a beat as I heard the familiar click of her heels on the hardwood floor. She was home, and she wasn't alone. The voices followed, slurred and full of laughter, just like I had imagined. I could hear my wife's voice, louder than the rest, commanding attention as she led her entourage into the house. She was putting on a show for them, playing the perfect hostess, completely unaware of what awaited her. I stayed where I was, hidden in the shadows, as they stumbled into the living room. They didn't notice me right away, too busy with their bottles and their filthy jokes. It was only when one of them flicked on the light that my wife finally saw me sitting there, a glass of whiskey in hand. Her smile froze, and for a split second, I saw a flicker of fear in her eyes. But she quickly masked it with bravado, tossing her hair back as she sauntered over to me. "Oh, you're still up?" she said, her voice dripping with mockery. "How sweet." I didn't respond right away. I just looked at her, taking in the sight of her, the way she had so effortlessly moved from being my wife to being someone else entirely. Finally, I stood up, setting the glass down on the coffee table. "I made drinks," I said calmly, gesturing to the tray of glasses. "Why don't you and your friends have a seat?" The men exchanged glances, clearly amused by the situation, but they did as I suggested. My wife hesitated, eyeing me with suspicion, but then shrugged and followed suit. They all grabbed a glass, raising them in a toast to God knows what. As they drank, I felt a dark satisfaction settle over me. They had no idea what was coming, but they would soon enough. It didn't take long for the drug to kick in. One by one, their laughter grew softer, their words slurred, and their movements sluggish. My wife was the first to notice something was off. She set her glass down, blinking rapidly as if trying to shake off the sudden wave of dizziness that had washed over her. "What the hell?" she muttered, reaching out to steady herself on the armrest of the couch. Her friend, the one who had been her accomplice in this sordid affair, followed suit, her head lolling to the side as she tried to focus on the room spinning around her. The men weren't far behind. The cocky smirks faded from their faces as they exchanged confused glances, their bravado quickly evaporating as they realized something was seriously wrong. One of them, the tattooed guy who had taunted me earlier, tried to stand up, but his legs gave out beneath him, and he collapsed back onto the couch with a grunt. "What did you do?" my wife asked, her voice barely above a whisper now. Her eyes were wide, fear finally overtaking her as she looked at me, really looked at me for the first time that night. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. The realization was dawning on all of them, slow and terrifying, as the room grew quieter with each passing second. I watched them struggle, watched their panic rise as they tried to fight off the inevitable, but it was a losing battle. The drug was too strong, and within minutes, they were all slumped over, unconscious. The silence that followed was deafening. I stood there for a moment, just staring at them. My wife, her friend, and the 6 men who had thought they could walk into my life and destroy everything I had built. And now, they were completely at my mercy. A cold, calculated calm settled over me as I began the next phase of my plan. I wasn't going to let them off easy. No, this was just the beginning. I started with the men. They were heavier than I expected, dead weight as I dragged them across the floor one by one. I didn't rush. I had all night, and I wanted to make sure everything was perfect. Each man was bound tightly with the rope I had prepared earlier, their hands and feet secured so they wouldn't be going anywhere when they woke up. I left them in a row in the middle of the living room, their bodies splayed out like broken dolls. My wife and her friend were next. I treated them with the same care, binding their wrists and ankles with the same precision. But I wasn't finished. I wanted them to see, to truly understand the gravity of their betrayal before I was done with them. I took out the handcuffs and used them to link my wife to her friend, their arms entwined in a mockery of the friendship they had once shared. It was fitting, in a twisted sort of way. They had been partners in crime, after all, might as well be partners in punishment. Once I was satisfied with my work, I stepped back to admire the scene. It was almost artistic, in a macabre sort of way. 8 bodies, bound and helpless, surrounded by the remnants of a night that had started with laughter and was now steeped in darkness. The only sound in the room was the faint ticking of the clock on the wall, counting down the minutes until they would wake up. I checked my watch. There wasn't much time left. The drug would wear off soon, and when it did, I wanted to be ready. I retrieved the voice recorder from its hiding place behind the bookshelf and set it on the coffee table, pressing the record button. It was going to capture every word, every scream, every plea for mercy that was about to be unleashed. This was going to be my insurance, my evidence that they had all done this to themselves. And if they tried to deny it, tried to pretend that any of this wasn't their fault, I would have proof. My wife was the first to stir, a soft moan escaping her lips as she slowly came back to consciousness. I watched as her eyes fluttered open, confusion clouding them at first, followed by horror as she took in the scene before her. She tried to move, but the cuffs and rope held her in place, and that's when the panic truly set in. What is this?" she gasped, her voice trembling as she tugged uselessly at her restraints. I stepped into her line of sight, watching as her eyes widened even more when she saw me standing there. "Welcome back," I said quietly, my voice calm despite the storm of emotions raging inside me. "I thought we could have a little chat." She didn't respond right away, too focused on trying to free herself. Her friend was starting to wake up now too, a groggy mumble escaping her as she tried to lift her head. The men were still out cold, but it wouldn't be long before they were awake and aware of their predicament. "What did you do to us?" my wife demanded, her voice rising in pitch as the reality of the situation began to sink in. "Let us go, you psycho." I didn't flinch at her words. I just stared at her, my expression unreadable. You're in no position to be making demands, I replied evenly. You all made your choices tonight, and now you're going to face the consequences. Her friend was fully awake now, her eyes wide with terror, as she realized she was bound and helpless. Please, just let us go, she whimpered, her voice breaking. I ignored her, focusing solely on my wife. Do you have any idea how long I've known about this? About all of you? I asked, my voice low and cold. Did you really think you could keep this hidden forever? My wife's face twisted in anger and fear. You're insane. We were just having fun. Fun? I cut her off, my voice sharp as a knife. You think this is fun? You think betraying me, humiliating me is just a game? She flinched at my words, finally realizing that there was no talking her way out of this. I could see the fear in her eyes, the same fear she had tried to hide all night. But now, there was no escaping it, no escaping me. This is what you wanted, isn't it? I continued, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. You wanted to play with fire. Well, now you're going to burn. As the reality of their situation sank in, I could see the desperation growing in her eyes. She was starting to realize that this was no longer a game, that the stakes were higher than she had ever imagined. And I was the one holding all the cards. The men were beginning to stir now, low groans filling the room as they slowly woke from their drugged stupor. It was time to get started. Time to make them all pay for what they had done. As the men began to regain consciousness, I watched their confusion turn to panic. Their groggy eyes darted around the room, taking in the ropes binding their limbs and the situation they had unknowingly walked into. The bravado they'd shown earlier was gone, replaced by the fear of men who suddenly realized they weren't as invincible as they had thought. One of them, the tattooed guy who had mocked me at the bar, was the first to speak. What the fuck is this? He rasped, his voice hoarse and thick with the remnants of the drug. He struggled against the ropes, but they held firm. Untie me, you sick bastard! I just stood there, watching him flail, his muscles bulging as he fought against his restraints. It was almost pitiful, watching him try to assert control when he had none. My wife, now fully aware of the situation, glanced at him and then at me, a silent plea in her eyes. But I wasn't moved. She had chosen this man over me, after all. This is your mess, I said calmly, addressing all of them. You're all in this together, so I suggest you start figuring out how you're going to get out of it. But I'll give you a hint. It's not going to be by force. The room fell into a tense silence as my words sank in. I could see the gears turning in their heads as they tried to process what was happening. My wife's friend, the one who had been so smug and self-assured earlier, was trembling now, her eyes wide with fear. Please, she whispered, her voice barely audible. We didn't mean for this to happen. It was just a mistake. I turned my gaze to her, feeling nothing but contempt. A mistake? I repeated, letting the word hang in the air. A mistake is forgetting your keys or losing your wallet. What you all did, that was deliberate, calculated. The tattooed guy wasn't giving up, though. He snarled at me, baring his teeth like a cornered animal. You're gonna regret this, you sick fuck, when I get out of here. You'll do what, exactly? I interrupted, my tone icy. Call the cops? Go ahead. Tell them how you ended up here. I'm sure they'll be fascinated to hear how you plan to fuck another man's wife in his own house. That shut him up. His face turned red, the fury in his eyes only growing stronger, but he knew he had no comeback. They all did. I could see it in their faces, the realization that they were trapped, that there was no easy way out of this. I turned back to my wife, who was watching me with a mix of fear and something else. Shame, maybe. But that was too little. Too late. The damage was done, and there was no way she could undo it now. How long? I asked her quietly, the words barely more than a whisper. How long have you been doing this? She flinched as if I had struck her, and for a moment I thought she might not answer. But then she swallowed hard, her eyes filling with tears, and muttered, "A few months? A few months?" I repeated, the anger I had been holding back finally boiling over. "You've been fucking other men for months, and you didn't think I'd find out?" She shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks now. "I didn't mean for it to happen. I was just what?" I snapped, cutting her off. "Bored? Lonely? Or were you just too selfish to care about what this would do to me?" She didn't answer, just sobbed quietly as the reality of her actions crashed down on her. I watched her for a moment, feeling a twisted satisfaction at seeing her breakdown. But that satisfaction didn't last long. The truth was, I didn't want to see her cry. I wanted answers. I wanted to understand why she had done this, why she had thrown away everything we had built together for, what? A few cheap thrills? "Who was first?" I asked, my voice steadier now as I tried to regain control. "Which one of them did you fuck first?" She looked up at me, her eyes full of shame and guilt. She hesitated, her gaze flickering to the men around her, but I wasn't about to let her off the hook that easily. "Answer me," I demanded, my voice cold as ice. She bit her lip, then finally pointed to the man at the far end of the row, a man I hadn't really noticed until now. He was younger than the others, with a lean, almost boyish look to him, but his eyes were hard, calculating. He wasn't panicking like the others. Instead, he watched me with a cold, almost detached interest, as if sizing me up. "Him," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "He was the first." I walked over to him, the sound of my footsteps echoing in the tense silence of the room. He didn't flinch, didn't look away, just met my gaze head-on, defiant and unafraid. "So, you're the one who started this," I said, my voice low and dangerous. "The one who thought he could take what was mine and get away with it." He shrugged, a small, almost imperceptible movement, but it was enough to stoke the flames of my anger. "She came to me," he said, his voice calm and measured. "Not the other way around. If you want to blame someone, blame her." I could have hit him right then and there, could have wiped that smug look off his face with a single punch. But I didn't. Instead, I just stared at him, letting the silence stretch out between us until it became unbearable. "And you just went along with it?" I asked, my voice dripping with contempt. "Because you're just such a decent guy, right? Such a fucking hero." He didn't respond, just kept staring at me with those cold, calculating eyes. And that was when I realized he wasn't like the others. He wasn't here for fun or thrills. He was here because he wanted something more than just my wife. But what? I leaned in closer, my voice dropping to a whisper. "What's your name?" He hesitated, then finally said, "Eric." "Eric," I repeated, the name rolling off my tongue like a curse. "So tell me, Eric, what did you think you were going to get out of this? Was it just about the sex, or was there something else?" He didn't answer right away, but I could see the gears turning in his head, calculating his next move. Finally, he smirked, that cold, detached look never leaving his eyes. "Does it really matter?" he asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. "You already know the answer." I stared at him, the realization hitting me like a ton of bricks. He wasn't just after my wife, he was after me. This was personal. This was about power, control, dominance. And suddenly, everything made sense. The way my wife had been acting distant, the sudden interest in new friends, the unexplained absences. It wasn't just about sex. It was about breaking me down, taking everything I had, and leaving me with nothing. But I wasn't broken yet. Not by a long shot. I straightened up, the cold anger settling over me once more. "You made a mistake, Eric," I said quietly. "You thought you could come into my life and take what was mine. But you forgot one thing." He raised an eyebrow, a silent question in his eyes. "This is my house," I said, my voice hard as steel, "and I'm the one who decides who gets to leave." His smirk faltered for the first time, the confidence in his eyes wavering just a fraction. But it was enough. I turned away from him, addressing the room at large. "You all made your choices, and now you're going to face the consequences." I moved toward the door, leaving them to stew in their fear and uncertainty. But before I left, I turned back to my wife, who was watching me with wide, tear-filled eyes. "This isn't over," I said quietly, locking eyes with her, not by a long shot. And with that, I walked out of the room, leaving them to contemplate the nightmare they had just walked into. The night air was cool against my skin as I stepped outside, the darkness enveloping me like a shroud. I needed to clear my head, to think about what I was going to do next. I had them where I wanted them, but this wasn't just about revenge anymore. This was about sending a message that none of them would ever forget. I lit a cigarette, the flame briefly illuminating my face in the dark, and took a deep drag. The smoke filled my lungs, the familiar burn grounding me, giving me the clarity I needed. I thought about what Eric had said, about how this wasn't just about the sex. He was right. This was about power, about control, and I wasn't about to let him win. I paced back and forth on the front porch, the wheels in my mind turning as I planned my next move. I needed to figure out who Eric was, what his angle was. He was too calm, too collected, like a man who had done this sort of thing before, and that meant he was dangerous. The night air was cool against my skin as I stepped outside, the darkness enveloping me like a shroud. I needed to clear my head, to think about what I was going to do next. I had them where I wanted them, but this wasn't just about revenge anymore. This was about sending a message that none of them would ever forget. I lit a cigarette, the flame briefly illuminating my face in the dark, and took a deep drag. The smoke filled my lungs, the familiar burn grounding me, giving me the clarity I needed. I thought about what Eric had said, about how this wasn't just about the sex. He was right. This was about power, about control, and I wasn't about to let him win. I paced back and forth on the front porch, the wheels in my mind turning as I planned my next move. I needed to figure out who Eric was, what his angle was. He was too calm, too collected, like a man who had done this sort of thing before, and that meant he was dangerous. I pulled out my phone and dialed a number I hadn't used in years. It rang twice before a gravelly voice answered on the other end. "Yeah?" "It's me," I said, the words coming out more forcefully than I intended. "I need a favor." There was a pause on the other end, and I could almost hear the gears turning in the man's head. "What kind of favor?" "The kind that stays between us," I replied, my voice low and urgent. "I need information on a guy named Eric. He's trouble." The man on the other end let out a low chuckle. "You know I don't do this shit for free, right?" "Name your price," I said without hesitation. "I don't care what it is." Another pause, longer this time. "All right, I'll see what I can dig up, but it's gonna take some time." "Just do it fast," I snapped, the urgency in my voice apparent. "I don't have much time." "Consider it done," he said before hanging up. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and exhaled, watching the smoke curl up into the night sky. This was a risk, bringing someone else into this mess, but I didn't have a choice. If Eric was as dangerous as I suspected, I needed to know everything about him. And fast. As I stood there, my mind racing, I thought back to how all of this had started. How a few months of infidelity had spiraled into something so much darker, something that was now threatening to consume everything I had worked for. My marriage, my home, my sanity. It was all on the line now, but I wasn't about to let it slip away without a fight. I flicked the cigarette butt into the yard and turned to head back inside. The night was far from over, and I had work to do. When I re-entered the living room, the atmosphere had changed. The initial panic and fear had given way to a tense, uneasy silence. They were all awake now, fully aware of the precarious situation they were in. My wife was still crying quietly, her tears leaving dark streaks down her face, while the others sat in sullen silence, too afraid to speak. All except for Eric. He was watching me again, those cold, calculating eyes following my every move. He wasn't scared, not really. If anything, he looked more interested, like he was trying to figure out what my next move would be. It pissed me off more than I wanted to admit, but I forced myself to stay calm. I wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of knowing he was getting to me. "Here's how this is going to work," I said, addressing the room at large. "You're all going to sit there and listen. No one speaks unless I say so. Got it?" No one dared to answer, but the looks on their faces told me they understood. Even Eric didn't say anything, though I could see the challenge in his eyes. He was testing me, waiting to see how far I would go. I grabbed a chair from the corner of the room and dragged it into the center, placing it right in front of Eric. Then I sat down, leaning forward slightly as I stared him down. "Tell me about yourself, Eric," I said, my voice deceptively calm. "Why don't you start by telling us all why you're really here?" He smirked, the expression sending a chill down my spine. "You already know why I'm here. Your wife, well, she made it pretty clear she wasn't happy with you." The anger flared up inside me, but I kept it under control. "Cut the bullshit," I snapped. "This isn't just about my wife. You're after something else. What is it?" He leaned back as much as the ropes would allow, still smirking. "You're smarter than you look," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "But if you want answers, you're gonna have to figure it out yourself. I'm not just gonna hand them to you." I stared at him, the tension between us growing thicker with each passing second. He was playing a dangerous game, and he knew it. But so was I. "I don't have time for your games," I said, my voice hardening. "You think you're in control here, but you're not. You're just a pawn in a game you don't even understand." He didn't respond, just kept staring at me with those cold eyes. But I wasn't about to let him win. I stood up, the chair scraping against the floor as I pushed it back. "Here's the deal," I said, addressing everyone in the room. "You're all going to stay here until I get what I want. And if any of you try to leave, I'll make sure you regret it." They all nodded, their fear evident in their eyes. Even Eric seemed to realize that I wasn't bluffing. This was my house, and I was the one calling the shots now. I turned to my wife, who had been watching the exchange with a mixture of fear and confusion. "You brought this on yourself," I said coldly, "and now you're going to help me fix it." She didn't respond, just stared at me with tear-filled eyes, her guilt and shame written all over her face. But I didn't feel any sympathy for her. Not anymore. She had made her bed, and now she was going to lie in it. I walked over to the doorway, my mind still racing as I tried to figure out my next move. The man on the phone would get back to me soon with information on Eric, but until then, I needed to keep everyone under control. Keep the pressure on. I knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The storm was gathering, and when it finally broke, I would be ready. They had underestimated me, all of them, but that was their mistake, and I was going to make sure they paid for it. The minutes crawled by, stretching into an unbearable silence. The weight of what was to come hung in the air, thick and suffocating. I could see it in their eyes, the fear, the regret, the dawning realization that they had crossed a line they could never uncross. My wife's sobs had faded into soft whimpers, her friend sitting rigid beside her, trembling. The men, once cocky and full of bravado, were now reduced to silence, their eyes shifting nervously between me and each other. Except for Eric. He just stared at me, that same detached curiosity in his eyes. It was infuriating, but I forced myself to stay calm, to keep my emotions in check. He wanted me to lose control, to lash out in anger, but I wasn't going to give him that satisfaction. I walked to the kitchen, the wooden floor creaking under my weight, The sound seemed loud in the silence, echoing like a gunshot in the tension-filled room. I reached for a glass, filling it with water from the tap, and took a long, slow drink. I needed to keep my head clear, to think rationally about my next move. As I stood there, the cold water sliding down my throat, my mind raced with possibilities. The man I had called would come through. He always did. But I needed more than just information. I needed leverage, something that would turn the tables completely in my favor, something that would give me the upper hand, and keep it. I set the glass down and walked back into the living room, where they were all still bound, still silent. The sight of them, helpless and subdued, gave me a dark satisfaction. They had made a mockery of my life, and now they were paying for it. I picked up the voice recorder from the coffee table and held it up so they could all see. "This little device," I began, my voice calm and measured, "has been recording everything that's happened tonight. Every word, every confession, every dirty little secret. It's all right here." I could see the fear spike in their eyes, even in Eric's. They hadn't expected this, hadn't thought I would go so far, but I wasn't playing by their rules anymore. "And here's the thing," I continued, turning the recorder over in my hand. "This is just the beginning. I'm going to make copies of this recording, send them to a few people who would be very interested to hear what you all have to say. The police, your families, your employers, whoever I think should know the truth." My wife's friend let out a choked sob, her face going pale as the full implications of my words sank in. The men exchanged nervous glances, their bravado completely gone now. Even Eric's mask of calm cracked slightly, his jaw tightening as he realized the trap he was in. "But," I added, my tone shifting to something almost conversational, "I'm not unreasonable. I'm willing to make a deal." Their eyes snapped back to me, hope flickering in their expressions. "You tell me everything," I said, my voice low and firm. "Every detail, every lie, every secret. You come clean, right here, right now, and maybe, just maybe, I'll consider letting you walk out of here in one piece." The room was deathly silent. I could see them weighing their options, trying to decide if they could trust me, if they could afford not to. But they didn't have a choice. Not really. I held all the cards now. Finally, Eric broke the silence. "You think you've got us cornered, don't you?" he said, his voice edged with defiance. "But you're making a big mistake." I met his gaze, unflinching. "Am I?" He leaned forward as much as the ropes would allow, his eyes narrowing. "You don't know who you're dealing with. This isn't just about your wife or your pathetic little marriage. You're playing with fire, and it's going to burn you alive." His words hung in the air, a dark promise of things to come. But I wasn't intimidated. I had come too far to back down now. "Maybe," I conceded, keeping my voice steady. "But I'm not the one tied up, am I?" His lips curled into a sneer, but he didn't respond. The tension between us crackled like electricity, the air thick with unspoken threats. I could feel the others watching, their fear palpable, but they were too scared to speak, too scared to even move. I turned my attention to my wife, who was sitting there with her head bowed, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. She looked so small, so broken, that for a moment I almost felt sorry for her. But then I remembered what she had done, the lies she had told, the betrayal she had committed, and any sympathy I might have felt evaporated like smoke. "Start talking," I ordered, my voice cold as ice, "and don't leave anything out." She didn't respond right away, just sat there trembling, her tears soaking the fabric of her shirt. But when she finally lifted her head to meet my gaze, the look in her eyes was one of pure, unadulterated fear. Fear of me, fear of what I might do, fear of what she had become. I didn't mean for it to happen," she began, her voice shaky and broken. "It started off as just a way to pass the time. I was lonely, you were always working, and And Eric was there. My stomach churned at the mention of his name, but I kept my expression neutral, urging her to continue. He made me feel wanted, she confessed, her voice thick with guilt. Like I was worth something. And then, one thing led to another, and I couldn't stop. She broke down into sobs again, her words dissolving into incoherence. But I didn't need to hear any more. I already knew the rest. It was the same old story. Loneliness, temptation, a slow descent into infidelity. But knowing that didn't make it hurt any less. What about the others? I pressed, my voice devoid of emotion. How did they get involved? She hesitated, glancing at the men with a mixture of shame and fear. It was Eric's idea, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. He brought them in, said it would make things more exciting, more dangerous. And I went along with it. I felt a wave of disgust wash over me, not just at her but at myself, for ever believing in her, forever thinking that she was someone I could trust, someone I could build a life with. But that was all gone now, shattered beyond repair. Did you love him? I asked, the question slipping out before I could stop it. She looked at me, her eyes wide with shock. No, she said quickly, shaking her head. It wasn't like that. It was just sex. Nothing more. But her words rang hollow, and I wasn't sure if I believed her. Not anymore. I turned my gaze back to Eric, who was watching me with a cold, unreadable expression. He had said nothing during her confession, had shown no reaction at all, as if this was all part of some game he was playing. And maybe it was, but I was going to make sure he lost. You've got what you wanted, Eric said, his voice low and controlled. So now what? You're going to keep us here forever? Torture us until you get bored? I didn't answer right away, just let his words hang in the air. He was trying to provoke me, to make me act out of anger, but I wasn't going to give him that power. No, I said finally, my voice calm and deliberate. I'm not going to torture you. I'm going to let you sit here and think about what you've done, about the lives you've ruined. I leaned in closer, locking eyes with him. And then I'm going to destroy you, piece by piece, until there's nothing left. His expression didn't change, but I could see the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. He knew I was serious. He knew I meant every word. I stood up, the weight of the room pressing down on me, suffocating me. I needed to get out, to clear my head before I did something I couldn't take back. As I walked toward the door, I paused, looking back at them one last time. My wife, broken and sobbing. Her friend, trembling with fear. The men, their faces pale with dread. And Eric, who had finally realized that he wasn't in control after all. This is just the beginning, I said, my voice cold and final. You're going to wish you'd never met me. And with that, I walked out of the room, leaving them to the darkness, leaving them to the consequences of their actions. The dawn was just beginning to break when I stepped back into the house, the soft glow of the morning light creeping through the windows. The air was thick with tension, the kind that clung to your skin and made it hard to breathe. I had spent the last few hours driving aimlessly, trying to calm the storm raging inside me. But no matter how far I drove, I couldn't escape the truth of what had happened. And now, it was time to end this. When I walked back into the living room, I found them exactly as I had left them, bound, defeated, and steeped in fear. The room was heavy with the scent of sweat and desperation, a sickening reminder of the power I now held over them. But this wasn't about satisfaction anymore. It was about closure. Eric looked up at me as I entered, his eyes bloodshot, but still defiant. The rest of them, my wife included, were too exhausted to do anything but watch me in silent terror. They knew the end was near. I moved slowly, deliberately, until I was standing in the center of the room, looking down at them. This is how it's going to go, I said, my voice low and controlled. "You're all going to leave. Now. But before you do, you're going to give me something." They exchanged confused, fearful glances, but no one dared to speak. I stepped closer to Eric, who remained silent, his jaw clenched tight. "You first," I said, staring him down. "You're going to tell me everything about why you targeted my wife. The truth. No more games." He hesitated, the defiance in his eyes wavering, but he knew he had no choice. With a heavy sigh, he finally spoke. "It wasn't personal," he admitted, his voice cold and emotionless. "Not at first. I've done this before. Found a weak marriage, a wife looking for excitement. It's easy to exploit, easy to control. Your wife was just another mark." I felt a fresh wave of disgust wash over me, but I kept my face impassive. "And then?" I pressed. "Then you showed up," he continued, his gaze hardening. "And you interested me. You weren't like the others. You were harder to crack, more resistant. I wanted to see how far I could push you before you broke." I swallowed the bile rising in my throat. "And did I?" He shook his head, a small, bitter smile playing at his lips. "No, you didn't break, but I did." The confession hung in the air between us, heavy and suffocating. I had expected as much, but hearing it from his mouth made it all the more real. This wasn't just a game to him. It was a challenge, a sick experiment in manipulation and control. And he had underestimated me. I turned away from him, no longer interested in anything else he had to say. He was nothing to me now, just a man whose twisted games had come to a bitter end. Next, I walked over to my wife. She looked up at me with tear-streaked cheeks, her eyes hollow and broken. Whatever she had been, whatever we had been, it was all gone now, burned away in the fire of her betrayal. "You can leave," I said quietly, the words catching in my throat. "Take your things and go. I don't want to see you again." She opened her mouth to speak, to plead, but I held up a hand to silence her. "No more lies," I said, my voice breaking slightly. "Just go." She nodded, her shoulders slumping in defeat. Slowly, painfully, she began to untie herself, her movements clumsy and weak. Her friend helped her, the two of them moving with the lethargy of the utterly defeated. They didn't look at me as they left the room, didn't say a word as they stumbled out the front door into the pale light of dawn. And I didn't watch them go. I turned my attention back to the men who were still bound, still terrified. "Get out," I ordered, my voice cold and detached. "And don't ever come back." They wasted no time. As soon as they were free, they bolted for the door, not daring to look back. All except Eric. He stood there for a moment, staring at me as if trying to find some final word, some parting shot to throw at me. But in the end, he said nothing. He just turned and walked out, disappearing into the morning light. And then, I was alone. The house felt empty now, stripped of everything that had once made it a home. The silence was deafening, oppressive, pressing down on me with a weight I had never felt before. I stood in the middle of the living room, surrounded by the remnants of a life that had been shattered beyond repair. For a long time, I didn't move. I just stood there, staring at nothing, my mind numb. It was over. The storm had passed, leaving nothing but ruin in its wake. But in that ruin, I found something I hadn't expected, a strange, hollow sense of peace. The worst had happened, and I had survived it. I had faced the darkness and emerged on the other side. But at what cost? I didn't have an answer to that question. Not yet. Maybe I never would. All I knew was that this chapter of my life was over, and whatever came next, I would face it alone. I took one last look around the room, at the empty chairs, the abandoned ropes, the overturned glasses, and then, without another word, I turned and walked out the door, leaving it all behind. This is the end.